Well, my hope, good afternoon, I hope that my materials do not, there's a lot of technology up here. I hope I don't mess any of it up. Thank you for being here in this nice, warm, unseasonable day. As I was telling some guests that are here, who I'll introduce later, we actually either have air conditioning or we have heat, but we don't have both. And so this time of the year, we actually have heat, even though I don't know what the temperature is outside now, but it's probably in the 70s, right? So, okay, so thank you for being here, and good afternoon. I'm Dennis Irwin. I'm Dean of the Russ College of Engineering and Technology. I'm honored to be here today to welcome you to this Stocker Lecture and to introduce Duke University Professor Blake Wilson, one of the recipients of the 2015 Fritz J. and Dolores H. Russ Prize. Blake, if you'll stand so people will see you before you come up here. I'd like to begin by welcoming some special guests with some unique ties to Ohio University and the Russ College, and they've come all the way from California, and I made sure every one of them came from California. So first, Ruth Davison. Ruth, if you stand or raise your hand. So this is a bit of a surprise to probably almost all of you, is that Ruth is the aunt of Professor Wilson, but in addition is the wife of the late Russ College Dean Emeritus, Beaumont or Bo Davison. And as I was telling them, there's a picture of him right outside my office door. My picture's not there because you don't get your picture there until you're gone. So, Dean Davison served from 1969 to 1971, then went on to become Vice President for Regional Higher Education here at Ohio University. And we can thank him and Ruth for helping pique Professor Wilson's interest in science and engineering. We also welcome Jamie Bird Davison, Professor Wilson's cousin, and her husband, Paul Page Hansen. And I understand today's your 10th wedding anniversary, right? Okay. And Alan Davison, another cousin, and his wife, Michelle. Thanks for coming, and would you all stand so that folks will know you're here. As I have already mentioned, our speaker today is one of the 5 recipients of the 2015 Russ Prize, which honored the recipients for engineering cochlear implants that allow the deaf to hear. Professor Wilson is a co-director of the Duke Hearing Center and is an adjunct professor of the departments of surgery, biomedical engineering, and electrical and computer engineering. In addition, he's the chief strategy advisor for the Med-El company in Innsbruck, Austria, a major manufacturer of hearing prostheses. Blake, I didn't catch that when we met before. Are you working with the folks in Innsbruck that also won the prize, the Hockmeyers? Yes. Okay. Great. Professor Wilson has received many other awards and honors for his contributions to the development of the cochlear implant, including the 2013 Lasker-DeBakey Clinical Medical Research Award, which is among the world's top awards for advances in medicine. He's a fellow of the Acoustical Society of America and a life fellow of the IEEE. And most recently, congratulations, I was just there, has been elected into the National Academy of Engineering. So please join me in welcoming Blake Wilson to Ohio University.
Yeah, I'm good. Well, I'm thrilled to be here, and thank you for the lovely introduction, and thank all my relatives from traveling from California to be here. That makes the day most special for me. Of course, the Russ Prize was a wonderful recognition of the development of the cochlear implant, which is the first substantial restoration of a human sense using a medical intervention. So it was a grand achievement, and many, many people contributed to it. Engineers, physicians, scientists, and the Russ Prize selected a few representatives, and of course I'm proud to be among them. Let's see here. Gotta fire this up. So here are my Aunt Ruth and Uncle Beaumont at their home getting ready to go to a university ball in 1970, when, as Dean Irwin mentioned, my uncle was dean of the engineering school. And I love this photo. It just shows the joie de vivre between them and the love between them, and they're magnificent, and as Dean Irwin also mentioned, they helped get me started in engineering and science. I spent the summers, and my brother spent the summers with them in Cleveland when they lived there, and we would do all sorts of things like go to what my uncle called the diggings, which were the construction of new highways around Cleveland. So I got my introduction to technology from them. Don't they look great? So, of course, the main part of my talk is about that first substantial restoration of a human sense using a medical intervention. And the path was long, it wasn't straightforward, it wasn't easy, and at the beginning, especially, there were many, many critics of the endeavor. So here's one example among the many. From a physiological point of view, Professor Klinke in Frankfurt said, cochlear implants will not work. Well, he was the world-renowned auditory physiologist at the time. And that's a rather categorical statement. That categorical statement was matched by dozens of others in otology and auditory science. Basically, they thought that useful restoration of hearing using crude electrical stimulation was a fool's dream, and they didn't hesitate to say so. So people using cochlear implants today owe a great debt of gratitude to the pioneers in the field who took all the arrows from these critics and persevered despite the criticisms. They thought it could be done. So fast forward to today, and most recipients of cochlear implants can communicate with ease in everyday listening situations. And indeed, most use their cell phones on a daily basis. Well, that was just utterly unimaginable at the beginning. At the beginning, cochlear implants gave an awareness of environmental sounds, but you couldn't distinguish among the sounds. You couldn't tell whether a truck was coming or a dog was barking, but you could be aware of the sounds. And the earliest cochlear implants provided some help in speech reading, or lip reading, as many people call it. Here we see a lively conversation enabled between father and son with the help of the cochlear implant. And you can see the external components of the cochlear implant on the side of the gentleman's head to the left. Immediately above his ear is a microphone right in front of his ear, and behind it is a computer-based sound processing system and a battery. And then above that unit, the circular unit on the side of his head, is a transmitting coil to transmit information about the stimuli that should be delivered by the cochlear implant, and transmitting power to power up the internal components, which I'll describe in just a moment. This photo was taken at the ceremony for the Lasker Award. The other recipients of the Lasker Award were Bill and Melinda Gates. So there's a science award and there's a humanitarian award, and they won the humanitarian award. And I did not know that Bill Gates' dad, Bill Gates Sr., was a recipient of a cochlear implant. I discovered it that day, and I was seated next to Melinda on the stage, and we had a nice conversation beforehand, and she mentioned that her father-in-law had received a cochlear implant, and I asked with some trepidation, well, how did it work? And she said that he had some difficulties at first, as many recipients do, but then several months later, he could communicate just as you see here, and it changed the family dynamics dramatically for the better. She was most grateful. So in my view, 5 large steps forward got us to this point, from an awareness of environmental sounds to talking on the cell phone. And talking on the cell phone with unknown persons at the other end and with unpredictable and changing topics, with hearing alone, with the restored hearing alone. And I think and I hope that by the end of this presentation, you'll appreciate the magnitude of that improvement and regard it like I do. This is not a scientific term, but as a miracle of the brain being able to take a very sparse and crude and otherwise unnatural input and making sense of it and making progressively better sense of it over time. So the first step was proof of concept demonstrations that electrical stimulation of the auditory nerve in deaf persons could elicit a variety of auditory sensations. They might be beeps or buzzes, but they were at least somewhat different, and that gave hope that if those perceptions could be combined in the right way, then progressively more useful hearing could be restored. But first we had to know that stimulation of the auditory nerve in man could indeed, electrical stimulation could indeed elicit auditory percepts. And these demonstrations were provided during operative procedures where a tumor was removed from the auditory nerve and it was severed, and thus the person was totally deaf. And then subsequently, electrical stimuli were applied and the person could report her or his percepts. There were several persons in response to the electrical stimuli. The second step was to develop devices that could be safely applied for a person's lifetime and used outside the laboratory. And these, for the most part, were all what we call single-channel devices, a single site of stimulation in or on the cochlea and a single channel of sound processing. And those devices provided the crude perceptions that I described earlier, and awareness of environmental sounds and help with lip reading. But the inner ear and the auditory system are organized according to frequencies of stimulation. This is called a tonotopic organization. So if you stimulate one part of the inner ear, a high pitch percept is elicited, and if you stimulate another part, a low pitch is elicited. And obviously you can't replicate that with a single site of stimulation. You have to have multiple sites of stimulation. So the next large step forward was to provide those multiple sites in devices that had multiple electrode arrays, arrays with multiple electrodes that could be inserted safely into the cochlea. Well, those devices elicited the different percepts, the different pitch percepts according to the different sites of stimulation, but didn't restore speech perception. And so what was needed then was a smart way or a better way to utilize those multiple sites. And that's the big step forward. And then a recent step forward is to provide stimulation in addition to that provided by a cochlear implant on one side. And this can be done in either of two ways. One is to present electrical stimulation to the opposite ear with an additional cochlear implant, or for persons who have some residual hearing, and usually at low frequencies, to acoustically stimulate that low frequency hearing in conjunction with the electrical stimuli provided by the implant. Oh. Now my screen has done something. It automatically transfers to another screen for some reason. But we can deal with that. So for the remainder of my talk, I'm going to describe the components and function of a cochlear implant. I'm going to say a little bit more about the history, especially those later steps, steps 3 through 5, starting with the multi-site cochlear implants. I'll present what I think is a cogent comment about medical breakthroughs and breakthroughs in general, and ways to think about design and projects as you're embarking on some difficult mission. And then I'll offer a few concluding remarks for your consideration at the end. So I've already described the external components of the cochlear implant. You can see the transmitting coil atop the outer ear, and immediately above the outer ear, you can see the tube that leads to the microphone input, the sound processor system just behind that, and the battery pack is behind the outer ear. Underneath the external transmitting coil is an implanted receiving coil, and you can see that in the light shading underneath that external transmitting coil. And across that closed skin barrier, information about the stimuli to be delivered to the cochlear implant is transmitted, as well as power, as I also mentioned before. Now let's see if this works. Oh, good. That stimulus information is delivered via a cable that leads to an array of implanted electrodes. And here you can see the array inserted into one part of the inner ear and following the helical course of the inner ear. If you look at the inner ear, it looks like a seashell. And the electrode array goes up that helix with a very flexible carrier and a very thin carrier, so it doesn't damage any of the inner ear structures. Each of these electrode sites hopefully stimulates at least a somewhat different population of surviving neurons in the inner ear, and in exciting those neurons, information is transmitted to the brain by the auditory nerve. The component that's not shown in this slide is the user's brain, which might be the most important component of all, as I'll describe in a moment. So the function of a cochlear implant is to bypass damage or missing sensory hair cells in the cochlea. And on the left side, you see cartoon drawings of the normal cochlea on the top, and the normal peripheral auditory system on the top, and the damaged or deafened auditory system on the bottom. And so I mentioned before that stimulation in normal hearing is frequency specific, and that specificity is provided by a structure that divides the cochlea along its helical length called the basilar membrane. The basilar membrane is thin and stiff at this end where the middle ear bones transmit sound information into the inner ear, and it's wide and flexible at the other end. And these different mechanical properties give rise to frequency selectivity, such that a high frequency sound will preferentially excite this end of the basilar membrane, whereas a low frequency sound will preferentially excite the top end of the basilar membrane. Situated along the length of the basilar membrane are sensory hair cells whose cilia are sheared when the membrane vibrates at those preferential frequencies. And that in turn releases chemical transmitter substance into the cleft between the synaptic cleft between the sensory hair cells and adjacent neurons of the auditory nerve, and then excitation of those neurons is further transmitted and processed in the brain. These sensory hair cells are very fragile. They can be damaged by loud sounds, they can be damaged by a variety of drug treatments. There are a bunch of genetic causes of damage to the sensory hair cells. But most fortunately, the neurons are far more robust. And in most deafened ears, they remain largely intact. So the opportunity exists to bypass these missing or damaged structures and stimulate directly those surviving neurons in the auditory nerve. And if you're smart enough about the patterns of stimulation that you provide, maybe the brain can be fooled into thinking that it's getting a quasi-normal input, and maybe the brain can make sense of that artificial stimulation provided by the cochlear implant. The right side shows an enlargement of the business end of a cochlear implant, the implanted electrode array. And in this particular device, there are 12 electrode contacts, and you can count them 1, 2, 3, 4, and so on. And this is a top view of the cochlea, looking down from the top of the head, as opposed to the side views in these cartoons. I think you need to appreciate that although this slide is big, the size of the cochlea itself is about the size of a pea. And it's filled with highly conductive fluids. So this makes independent stimulation among these different electrodes very, very difficult, because there's crosstalk or electrical interference between the electrodes due to the conductive fluids and the tight spacing. So this was one of the engineering problems that needed to be solved to make use of the tonotopic organization of the auditory system. So returning now to the history, there were many efforts worldwide to develop a useful hearing prosthesis for deaf persons, despite the obvious daunting magnitude of the task and despite all of the vociferous criticism, especially at the beginning. And the history dates back to Volta in Italy, who in 1790 decided to use his invention, the battery, to place a difference in electrical charge between his two ears by connecting the two ends of the batteries to rods that he inserted into each of his ear canals. He immediately pulled the rods out and did not repeat the experiment. But what he heard upon contact was a booming in the head, and followed by a sound of thick, gurgling soup, as he put it. He decided not to proceed with that. In retrospect, the sensations could have been elicited by an electrical mechanical effect, so-called electrophonic hearing, where differences in electrical charge can induce mechanical movements, and he may have heard those mechanical movements as opposed to direct electrical stimulation of the auditory nerve. Later in Paris, DeJourno and Aries provided these proof of concept demonstrations that I described earlier during operative procedures. But they stopped for various reasons after 3 patients had been tested. One of the reasons was that the tests were regarded as not completely safe. This was in 1957. Then Bill House, who was shown in a previous slide, heard about these experiments in Paris from a patient of his who brought him a very short newspaper clipping describing the experiments briefly. And House was so intrigued that he set out on a lifelong mission to provide a useful hearing prosthesis for deaf persons. And then, after he started his work, many other groups began to work worldwide. So the double dagger symbol shows step one, the proof of concept demonstrations. The daggers show step two, reliable devices. And the double S symbol shows developments of multi-site devices. And you can see that the multi-site devices began to supplant the single-site devices about 1975 onward. The thin lines show research and development efforts, and the thick lines show clinical applications of developed devices. So there was a lot of activity, and there was both a lot of cooperation and a lot of competition. The history of cochlear implants is really a human story, in my view, where people work together, and they also want to be first. One of the more important discoveries made during this early period was by Blair Simmons, who was a surgeon at Stanford. And he implanted an array of 6 electrodes directly into the auditory nerve rather than into the cochlea. And these electrodes were inserted at slightly different depths, so they stimulated slightly different populations of neurons in the auditory nerve. And what he and his coworkers observed is that when each of these electrodes was stimulated separately, it elicited a different pitch, but also that when any one of the electrodes was stimulated at different rates, different pitches would be elicited according to the rate of stimulation up to about 300 pulses per second, beyond which there were no changes in pitch perception. So a train of pulses presented at 1,000 per second would sound identical to a train of pulses presented at 300 per second. So this showed that the auditory system was sensitive both to rate of stimulation and place of stimulation. And that information was used subsequently in the design of multi-channel cochlear implants. It also resolved a large controversy in auditory neuroscience at the time, where there were proponents of the so-called place theory of pitch perception. The site of stimulation is most important or exclusively important, and versus proponents of the volley theory of pitch perception, where the claim was made that the central auditory system could respond to different periodicities of volleys of neural discharges according to the frequency of stimulation throughout the range. And this was unresolved up till then because the cochlear implant provides unique stimulus controls where you can separate the two, and you can't separate the two in a normally hearing animal preparation or a normally hearing person. So this was a great discovery and contribution. Well, there are many claims and counterclaims about the relative efficacies of single-channel cochlear implants and multi-channel cochlear implants by the mid-'80s. You saw in that prior slide that both had been developed. And so the National Institutes of Health decided to convene a consensus conference. And the NIH convenes these conferences to provide best practices advice to physicians in the United States and worldwide about particular treatments. So there have been NIH consensus conferences on pacemakers, on restoration of lung function, and any of a variety of medical problems. This was the first conference on cochlear implants. And the status of the field is well described, I think, by two of the principal conclusions from that 1988 Consensus Development Conference. First, the experts on the panel suggested that multi-site devices were more likely to be effective than single-site devices. And that was a logical conclusion based on the fact that the single-site devices couldn't take advantage of the tonotopic organization of the auditory system. And then second, that with the best of the devices at the time, about 1 in 20 persons could carry out a normal conversation without the assistance of lip reading. Today, almost every recipient of a cochlear implant can carry out a normal conversation. My friend Rich Tyler took a busman's holiday around Europe and the United States to evaluate most of the cochlear implant systems that were in widespread use at the time. And the results from that study are shown on the right side, where these tested subjects with the different devices were tested for their ability to recognize very simple sentences compared to the sentences administered today for cochlear implants, and 8 consonants. And the devices included one from Paris, the Cormac device, one from Düren, West Germany, one developed in Vienna, one developed in Melbourne, Australia, but tested at 2 sites, Hanover, Germany, and the United States, and a final device developed in Salt Lake City by Don Eddington and his colleagues. Each of these test sites, or each of these test centers, was asked to identify their 6 to 10 best users of cochlear implants. So these are data from the very best users and with extremely simple tests. And you can see that the controversy between single-site stimulation and multi-site stimulation wasn't completely resolved, because these 2 devices are single-site devices and all the rest are multi-site devices, but you can also see that this single-site device is just as good as one of the multi-site devices. Furthermore, one of the multi-site devices is far worse than any of the alternatives, any of the tested alternatives. So that question wasn't completely resolved. But in general, one of the multi-site devices provided a relatively high level of sentence recognition, about 30% correct for very simple sentences. Today's implant patients, most of them will score above 90% correct with much more difficult sentences. And this slide shows the scores for the individual subjects, where chance performance is indicated by the red circles, and above chance performance is indicated by the green circles. So you can see a wide distribution of scores for most devices, and in some instances, a relatively high score. So these 3 subjects, for instance, might have been among those 1 in 20 who could carry out a conversation with their cochlear implant and speaking alone. Notice also that for consonant identification, that there's a high preponderance of chance scores for most of the devices. So that's where we were in about 1990. Then step 4 came along, which was to utilize these multiple sites of stimulation in new and, in retrospect, more effective ways. And here I'm showing the first of those new strategies, and actually the simplest in retrospect of those strategies. The diagram looks daunting, except to engineers in the room who will think that it's dirt simple. Well, it is dirt simple. And one thing we learned in the course of this work is that parsimony in design, or simplicity in design, is so very important. Oftentimes, the simplest solution to the problem turns out to be the best solution. I just wish we had started there. We tried things that were far more complex than what is shown here, and they didn't work nearly as well. And others developed processing strategies that were far more complex than what is shown here, and they didn't work as well. One simple aspect of this design is that we didn't make any assumptions about how speech is perceived or what might be important as an input to the brain. Instead, we took the approach of presenting all of the information that could be perceived with multiple sites of stimulation in the cochlea and allowing the brain to do its work and sort it out. And so once we designers got out of the way, things worked instantly much, much better. So in this strategy, there is a bank of bandpass filters, typically 6 to 12, that divide the frequency range of the sounds we hear across normal frequencies from, say, 50 hertz to 20,000 hertz in normal hearing, into separate frequency ranges. And along the horizontal axis here, you see one of the channels of sound processing. So the first step is to limit the frequency range, in this case to a low frequency range, and in this case to a high frequency range. And then for each frequency range, detect the energy in that range of frequencies. And the simplest way to do that, as engineers know, is with a rectifier followed by a low-pass filter. There are many other ways to do it, but that's the simplest and it works well. So the low-pass filter controls the maximum frequency variations that are transmitted to the recipient of the cochlear implant ultimately. And that low-pass filter typically is set at 300 hertz or 400 hertz, corresponding to that limit that I mentioned to you before for perception of different frequencies of stimulation at a single site. The range between just hearing something and a percept that's close to intolerably loud is very narrow in electrical stimulation of the auditory nerve, on the order of 10 dB. Whereas in normal hearing, we have a range that exceeds 90 dB. So somehow this wide range has to be narrowed down to a very narrow dynamic range. Otherwise, the person using the cochlear implant wouldn't perceive much of the normal range of hearing. And that's the function of this nonlinear map, which greatly compresses the dynamic range of variations coming out of this energy detector. The output of that mapped energy variation multiplies a train of balanced biphasic pulses. This is the stimulus delivered to electrode 1, such that the pulse amplitudes follow the variations at the output of the range compressor. So as I mentioned before, this bandpass filter covers low frequency ranges, and this one high frequency ranges, and the outputs of this modulated pulse train are directed to the appropriate places in the cochlea. So this output would be directed to the apicalmost electrode in the implant, that upper top site that I showed you before, that in normal hearing responds preferentially to low frequency sounds. And in contrast, the high frequency range, the output of the channel for the high frequency range would be directed to the electrode that is closest to the middle ear, or the basalmost electrode, and the outputs of channels with intermediate frequencies would be directed to intermediate sites of stimulation in the inner ear. There's a signal processing trick here, and that is to interlace the stimuli in time such that only one electrode is stimulated at a time. And this eliminates the direct vector summation of the electric fields from electrodes that would be simultaneously stimulated. And that tremendously reduced the interaction among electrodes and greatly increased the relative independence of the sites of stimulation in the inner ear. And that proved to be important for making the implant useful. So here are the first results from the testing of this new sound processing strategy. The green lines show results for subjects that were using that Symbion device that I mentioned before, which was the best device at the time, using the best processing strategy at the time. And these subjects were fully representative of the very best performance that had been achieved to date in the world with cochlear implants. So we conducted these tests initially with these high-performing patients with a variety of speech reception tests that included recognition of two-syllable words, recognition of relatively simple sentences, but much more complex than the sentences that I showed you before, recognition of difficult sentences, low-context sentences, and recognition of single-syllable words. Of course, the single-syllable words have no contextual cues like you have in sentences. She went to the shop to pick up apples. There's a lot of context in that sentence where someone could guess the next word based on a few previously perceived words. There are no such cues in this test of monosyllabic word recognition, and that's the most difficult test administered in normal audiologic practice. What you see here is for every subject and every test, there is an immense and immediate increase in speech reception performance. All of these subjects came to the studies with at least 1 year of daily experience with their clinical devices. So they had a lot of experience coming in, but only an hour or two of informal conversation with the new processing strategy, continuous interleave sampling, versus the long experience with their clinical processing strategy called compressed analog. So you can see these upward slopes for many of the subjects, and the improvement was highly statistically significant. What was more gratifying at the time, when we were sitting there in the laboratory, was the reactions of the patients when they first heard this new sound processing strategy compared to what they had been using for at least a year. So one of the patients slapped the table and said, "Hot damn, I want to take this one home with me." And another one said, "Well, now you've got it." And the second patient was an especially experienced patient, so that meant a lot to us and motivated the studies. Well, we had these wonderful results with the high-performing patients, and that made us wonder, well, what about more typically performing patients? And results for them are shown in the blue lines, and the gratifying aspect of their results is that the improvements were at least as great as the improvements for the high-performing patients. Well, the typically performing or lower performing patients were in the greatest need of our help if we could provide it. So, that was time to pop the champagne corks. All of the major manufacturers quickly adopted this new processing strategy and included it in new products and new versions of their cochlear implant systems. And this slide shows results from one of the earlier clinical trials that was conducted at 19 centers in Europe for 55 adults who had received a particular type of cochlear implant from one of those companies and who had hearing in their childhood but became deaf in adulthood. So they had some knowledge of language, but they were stone deaf. I mean, the criterion was if a jet engine was right beside you and you couldn't hear it, then you would be a candidate for a cochlear implant. The candidacy criteria are far less stringent today. So in the upper left-hand panel, you see the results for the individual subjects shown by the circles for recognition of medium context sentences, and in the bottom panel for recognition of those monosyllabic words. And you see scores at different times after they first received each of the subjects received the cochlear implant, 1 month after, 3 months after, 6 months after, and so on. And it seems that the scores improve over time, and it's obvious that there's a wide distribution of scores, especially for this more difficult test of monosyllabic word recognition, and that the scores can range from about 15% correct to nearly 100% correct across this patient population. It's a little easier to see the improvement over time in this plot on the right, where I've shown the means and standard errors of the means for all of the administered sentence tests for these subjects and the administered test of monosyllabic word recognition. And the fascinating aspect of this, and what we didn't know beforehand, is that the scores improve significantly over time. And this implicates a key role of the brain in producing these wonderful results, because changes at the periphery, such as encapsulation of the electrode array with fibrous tissue or other changes that occur quickly, are far more rapid than these 1-year changes we see in these data. So the brain is somehow able to make sense of this very sparse input, 8 sites of stimulation with this device versus 3,500 sensory hair cells distributed along the length of the inner ear, and make progressively better sense of it over time. So the brain is really the tail that wags the dog in producing these wonderful outcomes with cochlear implants. In retrospect, our job was to provide just enough information and in the right form so that the brain could take over and do the rest. And by the rest, I mean at least 90% of the job. Well, there was a lot of excitement about the seeming improvements in cochlear implants since the prior NIH Consensus Development Conference in 1988. So the NIH decided to convene another Consensus Development Conference in 1995, and that's the most recent Consensus Development Conference on cochlear implants. So you saw the conclusions from the 1988 Consensus Development Conference before, and look on the right to the principal conclusion from the 1995 Consensus Development Statement. A majority of those individuals with the latest speech processors for their implants will score above 80% correct on high context sentences, even without visual cues. Well, that's astonishing. And it's a conservative statement because the patients actually were doing better than that. By majority, they mean, according to the data that I just showed you, at least 85% of the patients. And today, as I mentioned, most people are using their cell phones. Totally unimaginable. And I'm happy to report that Professor Klinke was delighted to be proven wrong and immediately acknowledged the wonderful results that had been, in his view, surprisingly produced with the cochlear implant. And he and I became close friends, and I remember with the greatest fondness a conference that he, Reinhard Hartmann, and I organized in Frankfurt on further directions for the future development of cochlear implants. So he was a broad-minded and open-minded person and was thrilled that these previously deaf persons could be helped. This photo was taken in Würzburg, Germany. So the final step, and the most recent step, because there are many possibilities for further steps, is to provide stimulation in addition to that presented with a cochlear implant on one side. And I mentioned the two ways before. Here I'm showing results for the second way, which is to stimulate acoustically any residual hearing that might remain in conjunction with the electrical stimuli provided by a cochlear implant. So in this slide, the data from the prior 1997 study that I showed you with electrical stimulation alone are reprised here. And then Michael Dorman and his colleagues at Arizona State University studied 15 patients who had received their cochlear implants much later and were tested in 2008 with a fully inserted cochlear implant on one side and at least some residual hearing at low frequencies on the opposite side. So the first two columns show results for electrical stimulation alone, and you can see that they're statistically identical across the more than a decade that had elapsed. And still today, this is typical performance for a unilateral cochlear implant, although many efforts have been made to improve unilateral cochlear implants. No big jumps have been observed with electrical stimulation alone. But in contrast, if an acoustic stimulus is presented to the opposite ear, you see this quite large jump up in performance. And most gratifying is that the jump up is produced by bringing up the bottom end. So again, the patients who need the help the most are helped. Here I've reprised the 5 large steps forward, or at least what I think are the 5 large steps forward. Starting with the proof of concept demonstrations in Paris, Dr. House's first implant in 1961, the advent of multi-site implants, the discovery and application of the new and more highly effective sound processing strategies, and finally, adjunctive stimulation with a cochlear implant. Also shown is a plot of the cumulative number of persons who have received an implant over time. And the dots show published data points, and if an exponential function is fit to those data points, the correlation coefficient is higher than 0.99. It's perfect. And so the growth is purely exponential, and the obvious start of the exponential is around the time of the multi-site implants and the new processing strategies as things started to take off. So the most recent published number is from December 2012, but industry records show that more than 500,000 persons have received a cochlear implant as of last year, and if the exponential continues as expected, then more than 1 million persons will have received a cochlear implant in early 2020. So the cochlear implant is by far the most widely applied neuroprosthesis developed to date, and it is by far the most effective in restoring function. So to give you a little flavor of what the modern cochlear implant can do, I'll show you a very brief video clip of featuring Dr. Deborah Tusi, who is our otologic surgeon at Duke, and one of her patients.
When I heard trees like Thomas?
It's made a big difference in his life. He's able to go to mainstream school. He's in a regular classroom. What would you like to say?
I like to say I love you.
Why do you love Dr. TC?
I love her because she fixed my ears.
It's a privilege. It's a joy. You know, it's the biggest joy of my professional career to be able to do a cochlear implant in a child who can't hear and know that he or she will grow up to have normal hearing. It's a profound joy. This is really a miracle.
So for me, the comment by the child, "You gave me my ears back," just tears out my heart. I mean, it's what it's all about. So I mentioned at the beginning that I would present a comment about breakthroughs that I think certainly applies to cochlear implants. The comment was made in the context of the development of a drug for treatment of cystic fibrosis, but it applies widely, and it applies across all disciplines, medicine, engineering, science, I think. The development of ivacaftor was a high-wire act from beginning to end. If you're looking for dramatic changes in medicine, you are not looking to be comfortable in research and development. Every breakthrough project I know about has passionate detractors. And the cochlear implant certainly had a plethora of passionate detractors. But it's through the courage of the pioneers to persist in the face of all that criticism to develop what has become, for want of a better word, a miracle in bringing a person from total deafness to talking on the cell phone. Utterly amazing. So now, today, from those humble beginnings that I mentioned before, the cochlear implant is widely regarded as one of the great advances in medicine and in engineering, and it's a foremost exemplar of the power of engineering to improve the human condition. Thank you. Before questions, for anyone in the room who doesn't know it, I should mention that this is Engineers Week, and that the 2017 Russ Prize, as Dean Irwin mentioned, was just awarded yesterday or the day before. Yeah, so I'm especially happy to be giving this talk during Engineers Week, and I'm even happier to be giving it in such a magnificent place. Thanks again. Thank you for your choice.
Hello. I was most impressed with the very last video there, where the little boy, who had been deaf essentially from a very young age, right, as a toddler, I could not discern any distortion in his speech at all. He seemed to be, is that typical?
It is typical for children implanted before about the age of 3 who were deaf before then. That's a period of rapid changes in brain function and connections and so forth. And so if a good stimulus can be provided before that period expires, then the results are typically fantastic, like you saw. And I think this child received his implants on both sides at age 2.
Wow.
And similarly, for persons who had acquired language before becoming deaf, if they receive a cochlear implant, results are outstanding.
Thank you. This is just amazing. It's wonderful and such a clear presentation of everything. Really,
Oh,
thank you so much.
Thank you.
I'm curious in terms of music and what you've seen with new processors or whatever, in terms of the recognition and what your, different patients are saying in their perceptions of music with cochlear implants.
Music is not as good as speech, and maybe one of the reasons is that speech is relatively simple. It's highly redundant, and the different speech sounds are very different from each other. In contrast, in music, in most music, you have incredibly subtle differences between frequencies and amplitudes and harmonic structures. The harmonic structure of each instrument is different. Things are changing more rapidly. It's a very much more complicated stimulus. We had a consultant years ago from MIT, Bill Rabinowitz, who told me in the early days, he said, "Wilson, if you can't get speech across, you're pathetic." And what he meant by that was that speech is so simple, probably through evolution, so that we can communicate compared to other sounds. I mentioned before how very sparse the stimulation is with a cochlear implant compared with the rich representations that we have in normal hearing. So it may be, if we can provide a finer grained input, then music would be much better. Now, with all of that said, there are some patients who have outstanding music reception and can tune a piano or play a guitar or perform. And we don't know how they do that.
Well, that's essentially my question, so thank you for answering that question already.
Surely you have another question.
Yeah, I'll take over. Thank you, right here.
Yes.
It's an excellent presentation. One semi-scientific, you said there are 3,500 hair cells that become destroyed and you replace. Does each one of those cells detect a different frequency?
Yeah, so these cells are aligned along the length of that frequency selective structure that I described before called the basilar membrane. So cells that are right next to the high frequency end will be stimulated by high frequency sounds because the basilar membrane is vibrating in response to those sounds. So those 3,500 inner hair cells are distributed along the length of the cochlear, along the length of the cochlear helix. There also are 3 additional rows of sensory hair cells that run parallel to the inner hair cells, and they have a different function than just transduction of the membrane vibrations and transmitting that information to the brain. The function of the outer hair cells is to sharpen the frequency selectivity of stimulation and increase the sensitivity of the inner ear to sound.
And you've placed in your implant 8 electrodes that span that 3,500 frequencies?
Right. So the present cochlear implants that are used today have between 12 and 22 sites of stimulation. So you put 22 in the numerator and 3,500 in the denominator, and you can appreciate the sparsity of the stimulation.
So one easy question now. What stage in your career were you when you decided, hey, I want to work on hearing problems?
Pretty early on. I've been working on this for nearly 4 decades.
You were a faculty, not a student.
Yes. It's been quite a ride. We had no idea it would turn out so well, but we'll accept good fortune.
Could you please comment on the durability of these systems and if they ever need to be replaced? And I'm especially interested in growing children if you have to come back and replace these systems.
It's such a wonderful and humanitarian question. Most fortunately, the size of the inner ear at birth is the size of the inner ear in adulthood. So growth of the inner ear doesn't produce a problem. There is some growth between the location of the inner ear and the outer ear as the head grows in size. So that an initial concern was that that growth might tug on the cable between the implanted receiver stimulator and the implanted electrode array and pull the electrode array out. But that lead wire is highly flexible and it's coiled so that it can accommodate that growth. Now, with all that said, this is the most complicated device implanted in the human body, by far. And so there are possibilities that things can go wrong. One of the principal weak points, or potential weak points, is the complete sealing of the implanted electronics so that body fluids don't get inside and corrupt the electronics. Also, there can be breakage of one of those lead wires. Today, with the cochlear implant, reliability is extraordinarily high, way over 99%. And so occasionally there's a problem and the implant has to be replaced, but the surgeons say, oh, that's dirt easy. And the replacement in the experience to date works just as well as the original implant. Alan. By the way, Alan is an electrical engineer too.
So we were talking about how many beads are on the wire, the sensor in the inner ear, or I guess it's a transducer in the transducers in the inner ear, and started off between 6 and 12 in number, and now maybe more like 22. Mm-hmm. Is more better?
No. If you conduct studies using different numbers of electrodes, different numbers activated, say among the 22 electrodes, and measure speech reception for each of those different numbers. So you measure speech reception for one electrode stimulated in the middle of the array. You measure speech reception for 2 electrodes stimulated, spread relatively far apart, and so on, up to 22 electrodes. Speech reception improves, depending on the subject and the test, up to 4 to 8 electrodes, but then plateaus thereafter. So with the current technology and that small space I mentioned and the conductive fluids, 8 is the maximum number of effective electrodes. So actually, the 22 is too many.
How difficult is the surgery on the patient? Like how much time does the surgery take? How recovery?
Yeah, initially it was difficult as the surgeons were working out all the procedures, and patients would stay in hospital for several days. Now they leave the hospital the day of the operation, and the best surgeons can do the operation in less than 45 minutes. So, and they uniformly say, "Oh, this is easy," and it's just a variation of surgical treatments of inner ear diseases that had been developed before, basically access to the inner ear so that these electrode arrays can be safely implanted. So surgeons say it's easy.
Thank you, Blake. Do you see different activity in Wernicke and or Broca regions in a person with a cochlear implant?
Yeah, you're so smart. There are different patterns of brain activation according to whether a person has outstanding performance with a cochlear implant versus one of the persons who have less than outstanding performance with a cochlear implant. And there are different patterns of activation, slightly different patterns of activation in the brain between even the persons with the highest levels of performance and a normally hearing person. So there's certainly room for improvement in these cochlear implants, shown at all levels, including the brain level. But on the other hand, I feel so lucky that they work as well as they do.
How are you're presenting this on language, how robust is it for different languages, especially tonal languages?
Well, you have the world's expert in your faculty here. Please stand up. Yeah, it's a privilege to work with him. And he's studied reception of tone languages extensively and production of tone languages for persons who have received a cochlear implant. And tell me if I misspeak, but their performances are good, but not normal. But on the other hand, if sentences are presented, which provide a multiplicity of cues in addition that co-vary with the tone contours, then speech understanding is just as good for a Mandarin user as it is for a user whose native language is German or English or French. So that's very good news. 1/4 of the world's population.
I'm an engineer, not a physician, but I've always been told that the inner ear plays a major role in balance.
Yes.
And I was wondering if there's any interaction or any effect on balance as a result of the implant.
Not much today. Initially, the surgery was a little bit more invasive, and so your 3 semicircular canals are right above the inner ear, the cochlea, and so trauma to the cochlea can propagate to those vestibular structures. But today, the surgery has been so well worked out that balance problems are both exceedingly rare, and if they're present, they're transitory. So immediately after the surgery, there may be some disequilibrium, but a couple of weeks thereafter, the brain has sorted it all out, and the person is back to normal.
Thanks.
Can you comment on the remarkable side effects of cochlear implant that is it alleviate tinnitus in a lot of patients? How does that work?
Well, it's certainly an observation, and I'm not sure that anyone has demonstrated conclusively how it works. There may be many, many causes for tinnitus, and so electrical stimulation may work in different ways depending on the cause. But it's incontrovertible that tinnitus is strongly suppressed, if not totally eliminated, with electrical stimulation of the cochlea. So this is a wonderful side benefit, and actually was the rationale for implanting patients who had intractable tinnitus on one side and normal hearing on the other side, with the purpose of suppressing or eliminating the tinnitus, not restoring hearing in that implanted ear, but suppressing the tinnitus. That's another piece of really good luck.
Hi. So there have been a ton of progress in the past 30 to 40 years with this technology. What do you see on the horizon? What's going to happen in 10 to 20 years with people who have existing cochlear implants, and will it continue to be the gold standard for people who are deaf seeking to hear?
That's a wonderful and multifaceted question. One response is that there's been some recent progress in stem cell treatment of the inner ear to restore sensory hair cells. And until very recently, the therapy only worked for chickens and fish, but not mammals. But most recently, a restoration of sensory hair cells has been demonstrated in mice. And so there's a mammalian proof of concept demonstration, and we're all very hopeful that this treatment will be developed further and will come to fruition and replace the cochlear implant. So if you can have the normal biology in place, that must be better than the artificial stimulation that we're providing with the cochlear implant. One of the best possibilities for the future in my mind is to make this marvelous technology we already have much more widely available across the world population that could benefit from a cochlear implant. So one of the estimates is that more than 60 million persons worldwide could benefit from receiving a cochlear implant. And I mentioned before that today about 500,000 people have received one. So that means only 1 to 2% of the population who could benefit actually has benefited. And so smart engineering to make the simplest design possible and drive down the cost. Also, even a slight relaxation in the candidacy criteria could widely open the bucket for persons who could receive and benefit from a cochlear implant. So I think what we have today is marvelous and would like to see it available to more people, especially in low and mid-income countries.
So at that, I'm sorry. Go ahead, Blake.
That's it.
Oh, okay. We do have a reception outside in the lobby as we go out. So if you'd like to join us, then I'm sure that Dr. Wilson will answer individual questions as well. So thank you very much for showing up. Thank you, Dr. Wilson.
Before you go outside, this is my favorite picture of Aunt Ruth and Uncle Beaumont. and you can see that it just glows with their grand spirit and love for each other. Thank you for your kind attention.
That was the clearest presentation I've seen.